So there's nothing like preaching on the most well-known verse in the Bible on what is arguably the sleepiest day of the year. Plenty of excitement to go around. Folks, we are going to get through this one together. I'm going to make you a deal right here. If you promise not to fall asleep while I'm preaching, I promise not to fall asleep while I'm preaching, and that'll be good, all right? Although I do have to say, there's a certain poetry in this passage, one that talks about Jesus as the light that has come into the world on a day when we move our clocks forward in order to gain just a little bit more daylight in our lives. Night and day, light and darkness, these are themes that play a prominent part in this passage, and further, they're central themes in this entire section of John. If we go to the very beginning of chapter 3, if we carry on into chapter 4, these are themes that are very important. If we look a little bit further around this passage for context, I think it's going to help us to engage a little bit more in what this text is trying to say. So this gospel reading of John chapter 3 sits between two very different but very distinct encounters with Jesus. The first one is who Jesus is talking to when he says this well-known phrase, and that is with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is this high official in the Jewish council. He is a man who is well-known and well-respected in Jewish circles. He's someone who held a lot of authority and a lot of weight. And interestingly, he comes to meet with Jesus. Very clearly, the text says, very quietly and in the middle of the night, under the cover of darkness, is when he decides to have this conversation. He's not ready for folks to know he's coming to talk to Jesus. And the second person who has an encounter with Jesus is in chapter 4, when we have a Samaritan woman. And as a note, Samaritans would have been someone who Jews would have not associated with at all. They were always the other, and one that would be a good Jew would not talk to them. But this Samaritan woman is a woman who runs into Jesus while she's out going to a well in the middle of the day at high noon, when the sun is high up in the sky and it is the brightest point of the day. And so as we're talking about light and darkness, we have these two encounters, one in the middle of the night, one in the middle of the day. And we look back at these readings, we can see that there's a connection here. Those who love the light come to it freely, and those who hide away do so because of their love for the darkness. There's an important distinction that we need to make, because it can be easy to interpret these latter lines in our gospel as an us versus them kind of understanding, as those who love light and those who hate darkness. See, certainly for Jewish leaders like Nicodemus, their faith was based on an us versus them identity. Their world was literally defined by two terms, Jew and Gentile. Jew, one who is respected, a child of God, and Gentile, a foreigner, an other, often an outcast. You were either in or you were out. This was their worldview. So one would expect that the Messiah of the Jewish people would come for the Jewish people, right? Doesn't that make sense? One would think that God would be following the same us versus them logic that Nicodemus was thinking. But he wasn't. And before we get carried away, feeling better for ourselves that we don't have this same kind of understanding, we need to take a moment to realize that for most of the history of the church, we have also added an us versus them dynamic to our own faith. An insider versus outsider kind of understanding. Those in the light and those in the darkness. See, for Nicodemus, the insiders were the good, God-fearing Jews, the law-abiding people of Israel, God's chosen ones. But for us in the church, I think we draw divisions all over the place. Maybe it's between evangelical and mainline. Maybe it's between fundamental and progressive. Between Christian or Muslim, straight or gay, pro-life or pro-choice, believer or atheist. We love to throw around distinctions, separations, things that put us in one category versus another. But here in this passage, Jesus is trying to get Nicodemus to understand. And that's why this verse, for God so loved the world, is so important. God did not send the Son to condemn the world, but to save it. Basically, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus and saying, "You think I'm here just for you? Absolutely not." And to really put an explanation on this point, the writer of John follows this story up by Jesus talking to which person? A Samaritan, a woman, an outcast, one who comes alone to the well in the middle of the hottest point of the day just to not have to see anybody else while she's out there. One who, the text says, has had 5 husbands. And the man she's with right now isn't even one of those. See, there's plenty of ways people have defined this woman. But in John's gospel, she is living, breathing example of what it means to be the other. But she's also the world that God loves, from John 3:16. See, John leaves nothing up for debate. There is zero question in this gospel. For God so loved the world is going to encompass more than we think it is. Therefore, whatever boundaries we set up to define who God loves, whatever exclusions that we think apply, whatever assumptions we have, they're no longer valid. Why? Because God so loved the world. And Jesus did not come for condemnation, but for salvation. But I think here's where things can get a little tricky. Because one-sided love does not make a relationship. God can't so love the world and force the world to love God back. John 3:19 says, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." See, John's gospel is about forming holy relationships, relationships that open us up to experience God's love fully, and that can't happen in the dark. See, there are plenty in this world who praise Christ with their lips, but live lives that show what they truly love is themselves, or power, or money, or anything that seeks to rob humanity of justice, peace, and love. And this is again where that us versus them thinking likes to so frequently pop up in our lives. Because we so often like to think and to believe that the people who loved darkness are the people who aren't in our pews, or the people who don't belong to our churches. But that's not the case. Jesus came to say, "You think you're the chosen one, Nicodemus, but I came for the world. You think others are the ones who are excluded, but it's everyone's choice." See, when we are left to our own devices, we will instinctively choose to judge others before we are willing to have the light of truth shine down on our own lives. Jesus is the light that promises in the end that every last one of our murkiest parts will be illuminated. All of our sin that we like to push back into the shadows, all of the evil that we are accessory to, it will all come to light. See, we can change our clocks ahead all that we want to make that sun rise up 1 hour later, but the light is still going to come all the same. And that's why we hold to what this passage says, that Christ came not for the world's condemnation, but for its salvation. Sometimes we need that light to show up before we're willing to talk about the darkness that's in our own lives. And sometimes it takes a push to admit that for all of the huffing and puffing that we were doing about other people, the real problem was in our own life the whole time. But remember, God so loved the world, even at our lowest, at our very worst, sick in our sin and denial, we are still among those whom God calls beloved. And that is the power of this gospel. That for all who see that sin and that darkness in their life, Christ calls us beloved. We just have to turn to see it. See, it's not that anyone is permanently left out. I don't think that it's saying that those who do not believe are permanently condemned already. There's no predestination here. In the next chapter, we see a woman who comes to Jesus and doesn't believe much at all about what Jesus is telling her at first. She retorts everything that he says, yet in this encounter with Jesus, she becomes one of his greatest missionaries, bringing her whole village to come and to know him. No, instead, those who don't believe in God's love, the only condemnation that comes to them is of their own brokenness, their own lies, their own hiding. See, they condemn themselves to a life that doesn't see the value God has for them. But remember, condemnation is not the point, and it is not the final word for humanity. In Jesus the Christ, we have the one who exposes all of our sin in order to do something about it. It's not just exposed so that we'll suffer. Jesus didn't come just to make us look at our sin. He came to diagnose it and to cure it for all of us. I think for the same reason that we so often hate to go to the doctor, we hate to think about the darkness in our own lives. We hate to have to see what the test says because we're scared to know the truth. But if we trust in Jesus, he takes that sin and that brokenness, those things that we don't want anyone else to know, and on the cross, he frees us from them, making us people who can joyfully step into the light, forgiven and unashamed of who we are. And that's the beauty of this. Jesus didn't come for perfect people. He came for people who have a story that says, this is how I am broken, and this is where I have fallen. But God loves me all the same. That is the power of this message, folks, is that we get to go to a world that's broken in sin and in pain and say, God loves you the same, even like that. We just want you to know. See, this is the message of hope that this world is meant to hear. That God so loved the world that he came to us, not to condemn us, but to save us. May ours be the feet that carry that message out into the world. Amen.